And just so everyone knows, the recording will be focused on the presentations, so don't worry as a listener. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Savannah and Shira, who we are very delighted and lucky to have. Between the two of you, do you know who wants to speak first?
I think I'll go first.
Okay, great. So Savannah, I'll introduce you with the bio I have for you. You can correct me if anything's incorrect. So Savannah Sly is a musician, dominatrix, and sex worker rights advocate who resides in Seattle. She became active in grassroots advocacy for sex worker rights in 2013. Compelled to respond to sensational sex trafficking narratives used as a justification to increase policing and surveillance, Savannah became a community organizer with SWOP Seattle, or Sex Workers Outreach Project. She later went on to serve as board president of SWOP USA from 2015 to 2017. Since then, Savannah has served as an organizer for the ACLU of Washington and as a national coordinator for the Old Pro Project. Sly's debut album, Independent Means, was released in December 2019 and is dedicated to sex workers everywhere. And you can find out more about Savannah at savannahsly.com.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for having this discussion. The question has come up, how can you stand in solidarity with sex workers and be good allies? And I think just inviting us into these spaces and having these complicated conversations with us is a great place to start. I do want to start with the fact that sex work is complicated. It's not, people tend to want to, like for instance, see all sex work is inherently violent and everybody's a victim of exploitation, or it's all, empowered workers who are making good money and we all love our jobs and we're all quote unquote happy hookers. It's not like that. There's sex work involves people from every rung of the socioeconomic ladder, every walk of life, every moment in a person's life, from the good to the bad. And sex workers, what is common amongst all sex workers is that we are vulnerable to violence and coercion of all different forms, and state violence as well, largely due to what kind of criminal status we might carry due to the work we do. Sex work, so you know what we're talking about, is a very broad term. Sex work is an umbrella phrase that we use to describe all exchanges of erotic or sexual services for something of value. So the most obvious type might be what we think of as common prostitution, which would be the exchange of sex for money. But many of us think of sex work as a broader transaction. For instance, it could be somebody who's trading a hand job for a place to stay for the night, fairly informal. Sex work is not always in person. It doesn't always involve sex. Phone sex operators are a thing. There's a lot of internet providers now. There's a heavy companionship component to sex work that people don't really discuss much. There's a lot of people with alternative or uncommon sexualities that come and get their erotic needs met from providers that might have nothing to do with conventional sex, people who are fetishists, things like that, or people who are queer and exploring their identities. So sex work is really broad and thus really hard to figure out what to do about it, because people have really mixed experiences in the sex trade. Most sex workers, as I said, sex workers are very vulnerable as a population. I personally would argue that it's because of the heavy stigma placed on sex work, as well as the laws, the criminalization and kind of punishment put on sex workers for trying to make ends meet. I would say that those are driving factors to vulnerabilities of sex workers, but also people come into sex work people come into sex work for a lot of different reasons. Some people at this point, it's like a common word. The phrase sex work was coined in the 70s by a Bay Area activist named Carol Lee, the Scarlet Harlot. And she coined the phrase sex work to give us some labor context to what we're doing. Sex workers are, that's right, Scout, sparkle fingers for yes. Sex workers are an unrecognized labor force. We call it work because it is work. We're here to get something out of it. We're not just doing this for fun. Sure, some of us have fun. Some of us really like our jobs. But a lot of people would turn to sex work because it might be the best or only option to really meet their needs at the time. And doing sex work out of desperation can be a really harrowing experience. especially if you're in a toxic relationship with somebody who might be manipulating you or taking your earnings or forcing you to work. Everybody's heard of like pimping and sex trafficking. Those are complicated dynamics that usually involve a person being vulnerable in the first place to exploitation. The classic example could be a very young person. Familial sex trafficking is not uncommon. If a family is in dire straits financially, or if there are issues at home related to mental health or substance or cycles of violence, a child could be vulnerable to being exploited by their family members, and that's not uncommon. But then there's also the reality that young people are sometimes faced with grown-up decisions. I know numerous people who are now adult sex workers who started as minors because somebody needed to put bread on the table. And so they decided to go and engage in some form of sex work to support their siblings or their parents or themselves. That is also not uncommon. When we talk about sex trafficking, federally, it's defined as somebody who is brought into sex work through force or fraud or coercion. So that could be trickery, literally physically forcing somebody, maybe an immigrant who comes to the country and their passport or their IDs are taken, or they're threatened with deportation. That's a form of coercion. Immigrants are especially undocumented immigrants, are very vulnerable to exploitation, not just in the sex trade, but in all labor sectors, as we know. Which is another reason we need to recognize sex workers' rights. I'm just going to put a little aside there. But where was I? Anyways, yeah, force, fraud, or coercion, or if somebody's under the age of 18. All minors are automatically considered victims of sex trafficking, which makes sense given how we view minors and sexuality in our country. And most sex worker rights advocates don't oppose that, but we also don't think it's right that youth should be subject to arrest, or that we should lean on law enforcement as the agents who would identify, detain, and deliver youth to services. A lot of youth in the sex trade, a lot of people in the sex trade, because of the circumstances we talked about, might be people of color, might be people who are, their level of ability prevents them from having a regular routine job. They could be migrants, as we discussed. People who are queer, a lot of queer people in the sex trade. Do we want the police being first responders for these people who are having to experience hard realities and just try and make ends meet? A lot of us would say no. You guys all asked some really great questions. I took as many notes on my phone as I could. I definitely want to talk about how the pandemic has affected sex workers. I want to give you a status update as to what's going on locally and nationally. I want to talk about some really shitty federal legislation that passed in 2016 that really kicked all of our asses. And then I want to talk about our organizing efforts, but I'll just tirade if I don't stop myself now. And I have a fabulous co-presenter, Shira Cole, who does amazing work on behalf of strippers. And I do want to say, when we're talking about sex work, we're talking about criminalized people, prostitution, criminal, stripping, legalized. So sex work is in various legal frameworks. And so Shira is going to share a little more about the other side of the coin.
Hi, everybody. I love everything that Savannah says. She's great. Well, one thing that I think that might make it easier to visualize is there's 4 different ways to for a government to approach sex work. They can criminalize both the customers and the workers, which is what they do almost most of the United States. And then there's what they call the Nordic model, which is where they don't actually go out seeking to arrest the workers, but instead they go after the customers. And that's what they've been mostly doing, although they've been doing a mixture of both models here in Seattle. So there's the traditional criminalization where they arrest the workers and the customers and anybody that like offers services, for example, like a strip club or a security guard. And then there's where they only go after the customers, which was called the Nordic model or end demand. And then there's legalization, and then there's decriminalization. So what we've always been advocating for is decriminalization. And that doesn't mean that there would be no labor protections. There could still be labor protections. So I think somebody asked, the difference between legalization and decriminalization, well, and somebody else asked what else is going on in the rest of the world. Well, one thing that's going on is, for example, in some European countries, they are just doing the Nordic model, which is where they just go after the customers. And then in a lot of countries, they're going after both the customers and the workers. And I will say that those four models, of course, probably the worst one is where they go after the workers and the customers. And then there's this theory that it's okay to go after the customers as long as you don't go after the workers. But I'm going to tell you from my own firsthand experience that actually is almost more harmful. If not, it's either as harmful or more harmful than going after both of us. Because when I was a baby stripper in 2006, I was actually arrested twice at the club. And some of my charges were things that I would have legally done in other states, for example, a topless dance or illegal touching. And but I was making so much money because they weren't going after the customers back then. We had a lot of customers. I was making over $100 an hour after I paid my fees. It was great. It was nothing to go to court for me. I paid my fees. I went to court, you know, a slap on the wrist, whatever. But what happened was for at least the stripping industry, beginning in about 2014, is we saw less and less customers come into the club. And I saw with my own eyes, I was like, I never got arrested anymore. I almost never saw police come into the club, but I just struggled to make money. It came to a point where I would try different clubs. I'd go all over the city working at different clubs, and there was just no customers anywhere. It came to a point where my house fees were what I was making. So I was going home with nothing. And so this idea that the Nordic model is okay because it's stopping bad customers is completely false, and it's very harmful. And it's one reason why I've tried to go back to the clubs now, and they're near impossible to work in. And a lot of the dancers that I know that I've worked with over the years have stopped dancing because of this push against clientele. And so what we're asked, to answer another question that I think Fiora asked was, you know, how can you stand in solidarity? Anything in the direction of decrim, but not legalization would help. And I mean, we could get more specific about the details, but that is generally what we would like. And you might wonder what's the difference between legalization and decriminalization is actually Savannah's very good at this. What was that?
You're good at it too.
Okay, so legalization, basically, you can almost see what's going on, you know, in Seattle. Like it's kind of legalized. It's very narrow what you can do here in Seattle. You can work at a strip club. And Cavalli, thank you. Can you go back in the room? Okay, I'm gonna have a meeting. Okay. Okay, sorry. It's very narrow as to what you can do, and because of that, and also because you have to have a very rare license to operate a club, that there's almost all the clubs are owned by the same company, and they extort the hell out of us. Our rent is anywhere from and it's not even just the base rent. Our base rent is $100 plus a night, and then over the years, since one of the ownerships was taken down and there was no more competition between the two clubs for our contracts, they've figured out a way to take over half of our earnings as fees for renting space. And I mean, we don't take up that much space, right? And so that one way to actually visualize what legalization does is it creates a platform where and this has happened in where is it fully, well, not, I shouldn't say fully, where is it legalized in Europe, Savannah? Do you know what country?
In the Netherlands.
Yeah, or is it decriminalized in the Netherlands?
Legalized.
Okay, so what I've been told is that where it's fully legalized is that it's such narrow pathways that a lot of people end up still operating illegally, and then they're still subject to the same forces that they are in countries that it's not. And so
really just hit the nail on the head there, Shira, with the difference between legalization and decriminalization, we can think about the cannabis industry and what we saw here. So there was, remember that golden era of medical, where there was pot shops everywhere, and yeah, you had to go, like there was very low bar to entry to, they stopped arresting people for weed basically while they were trying to figure out the medical system. And now we have legalization, and I've worked in the legal cannabis industry, and it is really, really hard to stay legal. Legalization creates a narrow set of parameters by which the given activity is, you won't get arrested for it. But if you step outside of those parameters, you're still a criminal subject to arrest. And so for instance, with the legal cannabis market, like if I am, I was a salesperson, if I was selling weed to a store, it was a very complicated set of hoops that I had to jump through to legally sell that weed. And even if by accident I was caught driving off the wrong delivery route, or if I didn't have my papers together, if a cop pulled me over, I could be subject to arrest. And I would be drug trafficking, because legalization just makes it legal in certain situations. Decriminalization is the removal of criminal penalty. Just stop arresting people. Decriminalization isn't anti-regulation. It just brings things into the civil realm. So it doesn't mean, like, so if there was a brothel, you know, it's like, there can be workplace standards, you know, like there should be soap in the bathrooms, but people aren't going to be arrested if there's not soap in the bathrooms. You know what I mean? I worked in Australia for a little while, and they have both decriminalized and legalized situations down there. It was really, and criminalized, that whole, and they're making more progressive steps toward full decriminalization in different states in Australia. It's a great model to look at. But in most places, it was mandatory to use a condom for blowjobs and intercourse. Most workers favor this. It helps, it gives us some bargaining leverage to be like, no, you really must practice safer sex with us. That said, if somebody got caught not using a condom, they're not necessarily going to get arrested. They will get fined. If it's an assault situation, of course they're going to get arrested. Decriminalization does not mean that assault, rape, battery, kidnapping, all of those things are not crimes anymore. Those things all stay crimes. Decriminalization just means that the act of consensual commercial sex is no longer arrestable. And so why we think this is so important in the sex trade, why legalization is not what we favor, is because there are so many people who depend on making a living in the sex trade who would be unable to perform to the level of procedure required to be legal. So just for instance, let's say you have to get a license to be a stripper in Seattle. You must have a license, right, Shira? Yeah.
Yes, you do.
So that means you got to A, have money to pay for a license, B, have the time and transportation to go and get one. If you have an outstanding warrant or other issues that might impede you from getting a license, there's lots of barriers to being a legal stripper. And same would absolutely go for all other forms of sex work. And actually stripping is legalized. That's why there are licenses. That's why strip clubs must be zoned in certain areas. And if you're caught doing something that's not allowed, as Shira demonstrated, you can get arrested. And we don't like that. We think it's really unfair. Also, for instance, like a red light district is a really popular example. And we talked about the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, the red light district is famous. It's pretty cool. I've been there. I've talked to the sex workers. Red light districts in themselves aren't necessarily bad, except if you can't get to the red light district. Like, let's say you live on the other side of town or the other side of the state. You know, let's say you have a family at home and you can't just abandon them to go and work in, let's say, a Nevada brothel. In certain counties in Nevada, prostitution is legal and there are brothels there, but there are quarantine rules, pre-COVID quarantine rules, where you must stay in that brothel for at least 2 weeks. You must be licensed, and you're not allowed to be seen outside of that brothel past like nighttime hours. It's like they don't want women of the night walking around. So those are all, that's a lot of control to impose on somebody. And sex workers tend to be kind of my body, my choice people. And we don't want state control, especially when the state has been so violent towards us forever. So that's the difference between legalization and decriminalization. We are strong proponents of decriminalization, stop the arrests, leave consenting adults alone, and still pursue crimes, sex trafficking, rape, stuff like that.
I wanted to add that also the Nevada model is also really exploitive because it's so regulated that the girls they take the house ends up charging them so much money that they take less than half of their earnings, and it's a very exploitative model. But
I do want to say that the legalized model works for some people. There are some people who really dig the legalized system. I mean, we would like to have room for different options. We're just really trying to move away from full criminalization. It's really not working. But I do want to, like, sex workers come from all walks. Sex workers have all different kinds of political opinions and perspectives. The sex worker rights movement globally advocates for decriminalization, but you might talk to sex workers who really prefer a licensed system because they feel safer in it, and that's valid. But so lots of different kinds of people in this industry. Also want to touch real quick on the Nordic model that Shira talked about. The Nordic model has many names. It was originally called the Swedish model because it came out of Sweden. It's currently being called the equality model in the United States, which is really ironic because it is literally partial criminalization. As Shira was saying, under the Nordic model, in Sweden, sex workers are fully decriminalized. They cannot be arrested if they're caught selling sex. Clients are really cracked down on. This creates an economic siege for sex workers, essentially, because it cuts us off from our sorts of income. It reduces cash flow into our economy, and that drives up competition. It drives down prices. It decreases our bargaining power as workers. And as we have seen, so the Swedish Nordic model, equality model, is very inspirational to anti-prostitutionists in the USA. It has been really popular here in Washington, but not popular enough to actually decriminalize sex workers themselves. We are still subject to arrest, even here in King County. And by we, I'm generally talking about prostitution now, or like illegal sex work as opposed to stripping. In King County, they have deprioritized the arrest of sex workers. But as we know, it just takes a changing of the political winds for that to be different. We want the surefire, like, legal code to change. And we would like to have our criminal status removed, also that of our clients. But yeah, the Nordic model is inspirational to policymakers here. And the reason that we're telling you about it is because you'll probably see it come up in conversation if you follow this issue. We are opposed to it. For the reasons I mentioned. Also because, as I said at the very, very beginning of this, we can't look at sex work as a simple binary issue. It's not all bad, it's not all good. It's a lot of different things with a lot of different stories involved and circumstances. So we need to bring nuance to it, which is, that makes it hard to solve issues of exploitation in the sex trade. What people tend to want to do is use broad brushstrokes to just, we're gonna stamp out sex trafficking. This is a war on sex trafficking. And so they do that with law enforcement. And they do that with censorship by taking down our websites. When we don't have clients, we make less money. That makes us more vulnerable to abuse. When we don't have websites to advertise on, it doesn't mean we just like hang up our heels and stop being sex workers. It means that we just have less safe places to advertise. Literally, website shutdowns have been shown to increase street prostitution. This happened, there was a chapter called Swap Sacramento in California that was really connected. They have a big 7-mile stroll there. A stroll is where outdoor sex work is exchanged. There was a really popular website a number of years ago called My Red Book, and it was a popular advertising site for the entire West Coast, especially California. And My Red Book, kind of like Backpage, kind of like websites here in Seattle, got shut down in the name of ending sex trafficking. Swap Sacramento's phone started ringing off the hook immediately. Where are the websites? Where am I going to advertise? Where am I going to find my clients? I need to make rent. It happened towards the end of the fucking month. And so literally people, sometimes for the first time, went out onto the street to go and try and find clients. Clients did the same thing. When Backpage got shut down, actually, this is when Shira, I think this is when Strippers Are Workers came into being, because shutting down websites, you're displacing sex workers, but you're also displacing clients. And so clients and sex workers will continue to try and find each other. They'll just do it in venues that are less appropriate for that. So that means dating websites, modeling websites, hotels, bars, and then strip clubs. Shira, can you tell us a little bit about what the clubs saw when Backpage got shut down?
Well, let's just say that it made it a lot more profitable to be a strip club owner, because now we had very little negotiating power. I actually would advertise on Backpage. I would do erotic massage, and I would advertise on Backpage. And when that got shut down, where am I going to go? I can't go anywhere now. Like, actually, I started on Craigslist. Craigslist was great because it was free. And then it got shut down. And then where's Backpage, where you had to pay for it, and it was $5 an ad, which doesn't sound like much. $3 a day. So see how criminalization just makes our feet up. And so I'll say that criminalizing, there's the criminalizing the worker, but then there's the criminalizing the customer, and then there's the criminalizing the services that we need. You know, this strip club we need, it's all we have right now. And that's one reason why they get away with charging us $100, $200 a night, because we can't go anywhere else. I used to say, screw you, you're gonna raise my rent, I'm gonna work from home. But I can't do that anymore. And so sorry about that. And so it's I will say that it's been really impossible. It gives you absolutely no negotiating power, and especially since they keep cracking down. Like, for example, in 2010 they shut, I don't know if you guys remember, but they shut down Frank Colacuccio. He's part of the mafia. They shut down all those clubs. Well, there goes all of the competition against Deja Vu to actually give us good working contracts. Before they got shut down, we actually had reasonable payouts, and now the payouts are 2 or 3 times as much. A lot of the services that you would just pay for, it's trafficking if you take money from a sex worker. So for example, if we're going to pay, we can't pay a security guard because that's trafficking. So what does that mean? We can't pay for it. You know, we can't even use our own money, essentially. But that, I want to talk a little bit about specifically the strip club. Okay, so the strip club, somebody asked about how do you guys, you know, you work in a community? And it's true, like this strip club was like the one place you could network. It's a great community. I mean, when I started dancing when I was 21, and I had very little self-esteem. I couldn't keep the only jobs I could keep were, you know, being a not even a waitress, just a busser. And it finally gave me my self-esteem. It gave me a community of women to work with. It was great. It was probably that I considered the locker room more of my home than my own home. Like, I loved working with other women. And the more illegal they make the industry, the more they take away our places where we can gather and be a community. Like, there's this idea of a brothel being such a bad place, but if it was truly decriminalized and we did have the opportunity to work in a brothel, it would be a great community space for workers. So the strip club in Washington, so Washington's actually the only state in this whole country that does not allow alcohol in the strip clubs. So one thing that we are trying to get out of the city of Seattle is to let us serve alcohol. And this is really important because the clubs have no other way to generate revenue other than giving us a house fee, which is anywhere from $100 to $200, and then $100 to $200 a night. And a lot of times they tack on extra fees on top of that. And so we're trying to ask the city of Seattle to allow to write a letter, because it's the Washington State Liquor Control Board that makes these decisions. So one thing that would be very amazing and very helpful is if we had support asking the city of Seattle to write that letter to the Liquor Control Board so that we could get alcohol. Because what we're asking them to do is not only ask for alcohol in the strip clubs, but also to pair it with caps on house fees, which theoretically you wouldn't need, but because it's so criminalized, there will still be the clubs will still have a monopoly. And so there's no other incentive for them to lower the house fees. So we're going to pair that with caps on house fees and stuff like that, and other worker rights. But yeah, Savannah?
Can you tell them about back rent and what back rent is?
Okay, so basically, as I was saying earlier, it came to a point where like there was just no customers in the club, and it's very common where the club's like, no matter how many customers come in the club, you pay us $140 a shift. And then if you're scheduled 3 days a week, this is how it used to be. If you were scheduled 3 days a week, your rent was 140. And so say you couldn't pay out one day, they'd be like, oh, don't worry. We will take away the amount that you owe us if you work another day. Well, what if you come in another day and it happens again? Then you're working 5 days a week, and 2 of those days you worked for free. So it's a complete Ponzi scheme. We complained about this right before COVID, and then during COVID, they said they were going to stop doing that. To my knowledge, because I've been routinely everybody that works at that company, they have not yet done back rent. However, they've increased other fees that we pay. So there's nothing we can do about it. They own almost all the clubs in Washington, and so we can't really go anywhere else because the zoning. That's the other thing. There's the alcohol, and then there's the zoning. The Supreme Court ruled a moratorium. In other words, you can't open another strip club as unconstitutional. But what all the cities have done is said that any new club has to be at least 600 or 800 feet away from a child use area. Everything is 600 or 800 feet away from a child use area, which is completely protecting Deja Vu's monopoly. So all the zoning all they're doing is protecting their monopoly, which is helping them exploit us. So the zoning laws, the ban on alcohol, and Savannah keeps saying that our field is legal. It actually is not. Like, for example, I mean, it is because a lot of people don't even know how strict the laws are in Washington. So some cops they're off duty, they come in and get a lap dance. They don't even know that they just experienced a totally illegal lap dance. But back in the day, they would actually arrest you. And I was actually arrested with several girls just for giving a topless dance. They went to jail for a topless dance. But it gets more extreme than that. Outside of Seattle, there's at least 3 clubs operating outside of Seattle. And these cities outside of Seattle have actually made it illegal to dance even within 4 feet of the customer. But that's impossible. You can't make money doing that. And so around the clock, 24/7, people are breaking the laws. And it's not so much that we would get ticketed. You know, what really happens is that this protects these monopolies even more, because no potential owner wants to open up a club that might offer a better contract if he spends $1 million creating a club and then it gets shut down by the city, because that's what's happened to about 5 or 6 different clubs in the last 10-20 years, is that the city all of a sudden decides to enforce the laws, they ticket enough girls, and then they shut the club down. So the criminalization of what we do is further protecting the monopolies along with zoning. And the alcohol, the ban on alcohol kind of forces them to extort us because they have no other way to make revenue. So those are the 3 main, those are our 3 main goals as SAW, is to get rid of the criminalization of the lap dance. We're just talking about a lap dance. And then get rid of the zoning that's protecting their monopoly, and then getting alcohol so that the club can make money, not on us. So that's what we're after. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to talk about. I think somebody mentioned something about women being vulnerable, and that's why they might be in this work. And I would like to say that I grew up, you know, seeing all these random images of sex workers, and it makes you put an idea in your head together about sex workers, that it's a vulnerable, exploited woman. But think about it, like, women have sex all the time. Women do sex, doesn't have to be sex. Women do sexual things all the time. It's just sometimes we want to get paid for it. And there's really no different, and I shouldn't say women, because there are people on all sides of the gender that do this type of work. And I'll say that just look out for all these images that you're seeing all the time in like media and movies and stuff like that. These are, I mean, our opponents are very good at putting these images in your head. Like, it's actually where I started working at Rick's in 2006. It was the most empowering platform I've ever been in. Like, you had so much power. It was so busy. If a guy said anything disrespectful to you, you could do whatever you wanted, you know? And so I just like to point that out, that women have sex, do sexual things all the time. We're just asking for an opportunity to get paid for it if we really like to do it. And so I would love to, Savannah, is there anything else you want to add or anything you think I should add?
No, I think we've been talking at these good people for a long time, and there was a lot of questions. I would love to see, there's a lot that we didn't cover that people asked, and so I want to see where we should go next.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That was like such a wealth of really fascinating information, and I can tell that that's going to bring up some more questions. I think I already have more questions. Shira, I didn't get a chance to introduce you before we take a break. Can I just like say my introduction for you, just to say, recognize how awesome you are? Yeah.
Two more things that I just thought of.
Yeah.
One, I now am a mother of 2 kids. One's 5, one's a year old. This is the only job I can do that would cover my childcare. No other job I could do would cover my childcare. And 2, I bought a house. I bought 2 houses actually in 2006 and 2007 with this money. So this industry is empowering. But yes, go ahead and introduce me.
You can tell me if I'm off at all, but I just want to recognize that you're an awesome organizer too. So Shira Cole is a dancer and organizer with Working Washington Strippers Are Workers campaign. That's what Shira was saying when she was saying SAW, stands for Strippers Are Workers. Through the campaign, she has advocated for stripper rights as workers' rights, for an end to the back rent system that unfairly saddles dancers with debt, for the repeal of restrictive ordinances and laws that impact strippers' financial security and safety, for anti-racism protections for dancers of color, for better health and safety measures for strippers in the workplace, and for worker-led policies created by strippers for strippers. And you can find out more about Shira and the Strippers Are Workers campaign at it's www.workingwa.org. And if you just Google Strippers Are Workers, you'll also find it there. Okay, I think without further ado, we should take a very short break, and everybody can go have a little breather for a second, and let's reconvene at about 8:08. All right.
Stop the recording.
Yeah, let's stop. And also let's just give our presenters a round of applause, because that was fabulous. Bravo. Woo! All right, see you folks in about 5 minutes.